final speaker for this morning in the crop management section is Joanna Follings from the Ontario Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Rural Affairs. Joanna is a cereal specialist and is passionate about supporting growers with their cereal crop production and challenges and opportunities. She's part of the Great Lakes Yield Enhancement Network team in Ontario, which is one of a global series of YENs that help local farmers better understand their winter wheat yield potential and what is contributing to that yield.
All right, so good morning, everyone. This is a tough slot to be in right between lunch, or now and lunch, but hopefully this is an exciting talk for you all, and I'm really excited to talk about our quest in the Great Lakes region to achieve record-breaking wheat through the Great Lakes YEN program. And we're really excited because there is definitely some interest in Western Canada to potentially start up a spring wheat YEN here in Manitoba, and then as well start up a canola YEN with the Canola Council of Canada. So if I want this to do the red thing, sorry. How do I do that? Awesome, thank you. Okay, great, thanks. All right, so when we're talking about record-breaking wheat, unfortunately that is not what we are currently achieving in Southern Ontario. What we're talking about when we think about record-breaking wheat is what those in growers in New Zealand and the United Kingdom or England are achieving, and that's what we're trying to accomplish. So back in 2020, Eric Watson, he's a really well-known grower around the world. He achieved 260 bushels per acre, and we actually had him come to Ontario 2 summers ago and had our growers had the opportunity to learn and engage with him, which was pretty cool. But then that record was then broken in 2022 by Tim Laminin in the United Kingdom, and I actually had the opportunity to go to the UK this past summer and meet with Tim. And he's a really interesting guy, and to be honest, I almost rather wish he was here talking to you than myself, because he is a wealth of knowledge as a producer and has tried some really cool things. And so these are the yields that in the Great Lakes region we think that we can accomplish. We actually believe we can accomplish 200 bushel wheat in the Great Lakes region. But I'm not gonna lie. I'll serve some humble pie and show you kind of where we're at today. And we have a bit of ways to go. So since 2013, we've seen a nice little increase in yields in Ontario. We've also seen a nice steady increase in the overall acreage. So the last number of years, we're sitting at about 1 million acres plus. This past fall, we had about 1,056,000 acres, depending on whether you look at crop insurance data or StatsCan data. But we're about 36% of the record-breaking yields. And so our goal through this Great Lakes YEN program is to try to bring our yields well above our current provincial average of 99.3 bushels per acre. And to be honest, I'm really trying to just get to 100 bushels per acre, because then Peter Johnson promised me he's going to retire. For those of you who know Peter, I'm sure you all know who Peter is. But yeah, so we're trying to achieve these high yields in the Great Lakes region through this YEN program, which is what I'm going to be talking about. And what I'm really excited to share is that we actually have growers who are well on their way to achieving those yields. So these are growers from the last couple of years that have participated in the Great Lakes YEN since 2021. So Nick Suin had the highest yield this past year at 172 bushels. Jeff Cook there was our highest one so far at just over 173 bushels. And growers like Jeff Crone and Mark Davis, they consistently are at these 150, 160 plus yields. And so through the Yield Enhancement Network, we're actually learning directly from those growers, diving into their management and understanding what it is that they're doing that is helping them accomplish these yields. So I've talked a lot about this YEN acronym, but what is it? So just a little background. So it was actually started in the UK by ADAS, which is the equivalent to your Ministry of Agriculture or our Ministry of Agriculture in Ontario. They don't have a Ministry of Agriculture anymore, it's all privatized. And it's essentially a global series of networks. So there's one in the UK, they're starting one in New Zealand. We've got one in the Great Lakes region with Michigan, Ohio, and other US states. If you guys know Dr. Aaron Mills from Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, he's got one in Prince Edward Island. And then now we're hoping to also get this into Western Canada as well. And so it's an opportunity for growers to network and learn from one another, but there's 2 key goals in this. And one of them is to actually evaluate how a producer is performing on their farm compared to what we think they could actually achieve on their farm through some modeling that we do. And then they're also benchmarked against their peers. So they're benchmarked on 90 different data points, and it's an opportunity to see where in their management they're doing really well, what they're accomplishing, and other areas where maybe they're not doing so well and they need to pay a bit more attention to. So this is a program that isn't for the faint of heart. The growers are very engaged and very involved in all aspects of the data collection. So I mentioned we collect over 90 data points. So growers enter through a database that we have, everything from planting to harvest, whether it's row width, variety, the amount of nitrogen they apply, the crop protection products they apply. They also collect a soil sample in the spring before any fertilizer is put down. They collect 2 tissue samples, one at first node, one at flag leaf. And then they also actually collect a whole plant sample. So they cut 100 stems at the base of their plants. They ship them to myself and my colleague Dennis Pennington in Michigan, and we spend hours, and I have counted spikelets in my dream at this point because of the processing that we do. But it helps us get things like biomass, harvest index, all of that sort of thing. And they also submit a grain sample to the lab, and that grain sample goes through nutrient analysis and all sorts of things, so we can look at crop removal rates and things like that. And then we also conduct head counts and take photos. So there's a lot of work that goes into it. There's both the growers themselves are doing this work, or they're working with an agronomist, and an agronomist is doing this. But what we've heard from the growers, because the first year when we did this in 21, my colleague Dennis Pennington and I, we went out and did this all for the growers, and now the growers are doing this themselves. But what it's done is really helped growers understand what's actually happening in their fields throughout the season. They know what crop staging is now. They know that their crop is at flag leaf and they need to be getting out there for their T2 fungicide, whereas before they'd be like, well, it's May the 15th, like I think I gotta go. So it's really getting them involved and engaged. And then another aspect that we do is we actually model or try to estimate what we think they can produce on their farm. So we generate what's called a yield potential. And so what is assumed, or there's a couple assumptions when it comes to calculating this yield potential. We assume you're someone that does perfect management. So if your crop was perfectly managed, this is what your yield potential would be. We assume in terms of solar radiation, what's incidence and interception we also measure. So we assume that the crop absorbs 70% of the available solar radiation from green up to flowering, and then from flowering to maturity, that gets bumped up to 95%. We make assumptions like 1.5 tons of biomass is produced for every terajoule of intercepted sunlight. We also assume that 18 millimeters of water is used for every ton of biomass. So those sorts of things go into that. We've used the UK model to help us get started, but then we used, someone mentioned earlier, registration trials. So we also have that in Ontario for cereal crops. So we've got years and years and years of trial data. So we use that trial data and measurements within those variety performance plots to help us validate this. But that's kind of what we use so when you hear me talk a lot about yield potential, this is what I'm referring to. So in terms of our geographical distribution, so I mentioned we started with a pilot in 2021. We had about, I think it was 25 farms in Ontario, and the rest were in Michigan and Ohio. So we had 43 farms. That more than doubled in 22 to 98. Then in 23, we went to 156, and then this past year, we're up to 186. And we have registration open for 2025. And if I recall, we're already at about like 75 participants, and we just opened. So growers are loving this program. They're getting engaged, and I would say a lot of those farms that started in 21 are still in it today, which has been pretty cool. And then yeah, this just gives you a sense of some of the states involved. So the first year we were really focusing just Ontario, Michigan, Ohio, and we had 1 or 2 growers in New York, and now we actually had a grower all the way from Washington sign up. And so they grow a lot of great wheat out there, and so it's been really cool. And these growers, I cannot get over how much they get engaged and involved. They come to the summer meetings, they'll fly to the summer meetings and to the wrap-up meetings, like they love this program. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what goes into the report, and then I'm also going to talk about some of the things that we've learned from the data over the last couple years. So as I mentioned, we collect about 90 data points or over 90 data points, and we generate a 30-page report for each grower or for each field. And what that report highlights to them is where they rank in yield across all their peers, where they rank in their yield potential, how much of their yield, the percent of their yield potential they achieved. It highlights the average yields in the program, all sorts of things. But what we do for each individual data point is we generate this box plot. And what this box plot does is it shows the lowest, the highest values across all farms. It shows the middle value, so what the average is, and then in that yellow line is what the farmer's metric was, or point for that data point. And then the green value is what the top 10% of the highest yielding producers, what their values were for each of those data points, so that they can see what those high yielding producers are doing and how they compare, and just how they compare as a whole. So this is just an example for phosphorus as an example. So you can see there we show the grower how much P2O5 or how much phosphorus they applied. We show them their soil test values, their two different tissue test values, as well as their grain analysis. And then we also calculate or generate this nutrient removal chart. And so what it enables a grower to do is to see, say their total nutrient removal for phosphorus was extremely low, just as an example, they could go back to those soil tests, to those tissue tests, and see if there was a gap, or if they were, had low values and perhaps they didn't put phosphorus on at all, and maybe this is something that they need to change. But it gives them a bit of a report card of how they did throughout the season. So this is just for phosphorus as an example, but we do this for everything, for seeding rates, planting date, the amount of nitrogen you apply. We also look at a lot of environment data, so we look at solar radiation intercepted, solar radiation incidence, total available water, estimated use of water, all sorts of things. So it sounds overwhelming, but growers love this report, and they probably read it for 6 months because they find something new every single time, and it's a really good resource for them. So the growers get this report, but then we get lots of questions about, well, okay, so what did the tillage data say? What did tillage look like across the farms? What did nitrogen look like across the farms? What were the yields based on all of that? So we do a wrap-up meeting in January. We do one in Ontario, Michigan, and Kentucky. And when we dive into that, so the growers tell us what they want to see. It's a program by the growers for the growers. So this is a very common one. Growers in Ontario or in the Great Lakes region are typically using no-till, but that's a big question. What does yield impact of a little bit of tillage, like minimum tillage, or full conventional tillage look like compared to no-till? Because we're in an area where we plant primarily after soybeans and edible beans, whereas in places like Kentucky, they're planting after corn. So their residue management lens is completely different than those in say, Michigan and Ontario. So we dive into some of these things for growers. So you can see most growers are using no-till, not huge differences in yield there. We also get questions about the varieties that are grown. I should emphasize, these are not side-by-side trials, so keep that in mind. So we're very careful with what we say about varieties, especially for those of you who work for seed companies. We don't want to upset you. But there are, in the end, this year alone, we had 71 different varieties were grown. Recognize we are working with our U.S. partners, and in the U.S., unlike Canada, a variety can only have one name, as you all know, and can only be marketed as one name. But in the U.S., a variety can be marketed with 10 different names. Yeah, and it's very difficult to actually decipher who the parent lines are for those varieties. So we're a bit cautious on the variety side of things. But you can see what the most widely grown variety this past year was 25R64, which is a newer pioneer variety. A lot of producers in Ontario and Michigan grew that this year. But a lot of the other varieties, there's only a few growers growing each of them. We also look at pretty intensively the crop protection use across all farms. So in that first column there, you can see this is the amount of participants per each region. So fungicide use, I would say, is pretty wide across the region, regardless of where you are. But where things start to get really interesting is when you get into the PGRs and into the insecticides. So like Darren just had mentioned about PGR use and the need to manage lodging. So in Ontario, that has really taken off. It's definitely a tool that we're using more. but it's still something kind of on the up and up in the US. We were lucky to get Modus before them, I believe, and so it's really just starting to take off there. But we found really interesting in the data is in Ontario, we never use insecticides, ever. And I think that's primarily due to the great work that Tracy Bowdy has been doing with IPM. But in the US, almost everyone is just throwing it in the tank every pass they make across the field. And a lot of that has to do with, it's cheap, right? It's, it's $2, $3 an acre for them to throw in the tank. But for us, we have very limited products here in Canada, and in Eastern Canada especially. I think we have some less than maybe even here. So it's not a common practice. So we've really focused and emphasized some messages to those US growers and tried to pull some data to say, hey, you don't actually need to be doing this, and here's why. So we give growers a bit of snapshot of that. This is the one that we always get asked the most about is, what do fungicides look like? So the 20, I apologize, I should have maybe put the 24 data in here, but I thought I'd throw in all 4 years data. This year we had a really bad stripe rust year, or maybe you guys call it yellow rust. But basically it's like the kiss of death, they call it in England. So we had a really high stripe rust year in between flag leaf and pollination. So we saw a lot of what I call almost like a T2.5 fungicide go on. But we get lots of questions, what does that look like? So everything in green is a single application and everything in blue is a multi-application. Most growers across all 4 years are applying a T1, so an early fungicide for septoria, powdery mildew. Those two are the primary diseases when we're looking at the early stages. And then, a good chunk are just applying a T3. I know Manitoba, I was talking to Andrew here earlier from Manitoba Crop Alliance, that fusarium is a big challenge for you here in Manitoba as well. So that's something we can very closely relate on. So that's just the number of farms that are using it, but this is the part that growers want to see, and it's what does the yield data look like? And so when we looked at all 4 years of the data, if you're not applying a fungicide, your average yield is 100 bushels per acre. And if you're applying both a T1 and a T3, that jumps up to 122 bushels. And even just a T3 was 115 bushels. So we are seeing massive responses and continue to see, especially to that later fungicide application. We did have a grower apply a T4 this year, so they applied later quite a bit later than pollination. And he had a very high yield there, but we haven't been able to completely tease that out to get a sense if that was just the fungicide there. But these are the types of things that we present to the growers, or the growers ask us, and that we tried to dive into. We also look at things like nutrients. So you can see here in the blue is the total rate of nitrogen applied, and the green is just what's applied in the spring. So unlike Manitoba, and I apologize if I have this wrong, we apply barely any nitrogen in the fall. We are in a climate where the risk loss is just way too great, and so it's something we just don't do at all. So sometimes I hear these press releases in national magazines saying, okay, your nitrogen on. I'm like, no, this is bad. But so in Ontario, we typically put the bulk of our nitrogen on in the spring, and we're only putting about, in 21 we were as low as 10, and in 22 we were as high as 25. But typically we're in that, I would say, 10 to 20 pounds per acre in the fall, and that's only just coming from our MAP or our MES, or some growers using some custom blends. So typically we're not putting very much on in the fall, and we also look at the number of apps. So we had most growers on average are doing 3, 1 in the fall with that starter, 2 in the spring. But when we actually break this out, I think is where things get really interesting. So on the left is the 2024 only, and on the right is 21 to 24. And I put 24 in there just to highlight this is what most years do look like. But you can see here that this is just spring applications, and most growers are split applying their nitrogen in 2 applications. So they're not putting on single applications. So almost 54% of producers are doing a 2-pass program in the spring. 27% of them are using a single app, and 14% are using a 3-way split. And I would say when I break out the data by class, that 3-way split is primarily hard red wheat growers that are doing that 3rd application to bump up that, and they're doing it later just to bump up that protein. We do have some growers from Ohio, and Ohio has some very strict rules around fertilizer applications. So those fall applications are all from Ohio. So some of their growers have to put it all up front in the fall based on an agronomist signing off. And then we do have a couple of organic producers. I can't remember, someone mentioned 3Gen Organics. I actually think the Israels were in our program maybe the second year. So we do have a couple of other organic producers that participate. But when we layer the yield data on this, this is where growers, get really excited. So when we go from a single application to a 2 application, we're about 111 bushels per acre for all 4 years and even in 2024. But when we jump to a split application, that goes up by 7-8 bushels per acre. So we are seeing that benefit to that split application. Now, as we go from a 2 to a 4 to a 3 or a 3 to a 4, that jump isn't quite as big, but we do still see that consistent increase in yield. But we really see that significant response to that 2 application. And I argue for growers, it just gives you the ability to tailor your management to the season. We know the springs can start one way and things can completely turn to a different direction. And doing, in my opinion, a 2-way split or a 3-way split gives you that option or that ability to tailor your management to the season. So in terms of what yields look like, and again, this is just, I'm going to jump into more stuff, but this is just kind of some of the general things that we get from that report and from the data that we share with the growers. So in terms of average yields, so we're sitting at about 115 to 120 bushels per acre is kind of been our average the last couple of years. But when we layer that on top of with what we think growers could achieve, so through our modeling, that's actually closer to 200, and in 2021 we were as high as 220. So right now we're achieving anywhere from 50 to 70% of what a field could actually produce, or what these fields could produce. And so our goal with this program is to make those yellow bars bigger. We want to get those yellow bars to 90% if we can. And so that's what we're trying to achieve with this. The other thing we're just starting to jump into, because now that we have multi-year data, is soil type. I'm not going to go into this too much, but we're trying to look at, what does those nitrogen response look like on a sandy loam versus a clay? What do yields look like on the different soil types? What's crop protection response like between different soil types, because we are in such a large geography. So that's kind of the report. Another thing that we do is a correlation analysis. So we wanted to dive into, so we got all of these metrics, all of these data points, and we wanted to know, okay, which one of those pieces are highly correlated to yield. And I just want to emphasize that correlation doesn't always mean causation. It's ability to help you understand trends and dive deeper into that. And we're hoping we get some funding for a grad student to help us dive into this a little more statistically, because again, correlation is not causation. So what are the factors that are correlated to yield in the Great Lakes region? There are these 3 things: total biomass produced, the number of heads per meter squared, and the number of grains per meter square. So it's not rocket science, but when you have this data and you can show the growers the data, and others have mentioned this, it becomes really powerful and can really help them make better decisions on farm, or conduct management practices that help achieve higher biomass, higher heads per meter square, etc. So these are just kind of the correlations there. So you can see for total biomass, for total grain yield, total biomass had a correlation of 0.82, grains per meter square 0.79, and heads 0.53. And then when you looked at what was correlated to biomass, it was the heads and the grains, but also the estimated use of water. And that's something that we need to dive a little bit deeper into, and I'll get into why in a second here. And then with heads per meter square is definitely about water, but what was interesting is that we were finding as heads per meter square were going up, the grains per head was going down. So trying to find that balance, and I'm seeing some head nods, so we all experience this, and that's something that we're trying to figure out a bit more. Excuse me. So when we talk about heads per meter square, what is a good number? I guess is the question that we always get. So when we look at the 4 years of data, I should mention 21 is, you're always going to see it, it's a little bit higher or a little bit off. And we think that this is because in 21, we handpicked the farms that were participating. And to be honest, these farms were all already high managing farms, well producing farms. It was also a much smaller geography. So that's why you're seeing some of the 21 data skew, just to keep that in mind. But so on average, as a whole, we're about 100 or 750 heads per meter square, give or take. But what we like to do is actually break it out by the top 20% of producers, so the highest yielding producers, the top 20%. We like to compare those to the bottom 20% and see what are the differences there. So when we look at things like heads per meter square, when you break that out by those top and bottom 20%, that's where things get really interesting. And you can see there that the high yielding producers are consistently getting 900 plus heads per meter square year over year. And the lower yielding producers are getting about 500 to 600 heads per meter square. So it's quite significant. Same with kernels per meter square. Not huge differences on average across the years, 21 to 23,000 kernels per meter square. But again, when you break out the top and the bottom producers, we're seeing 10,000 kernels per meter square difference and higher year over year. So this is where growers get really excited and they want to learn more about what those top yielding producers are doing. If we look at biomass, on average, we're about 13,000 pounds per acre. Again, that's 16,000 pounds. Keep in mind, we had some high yielding producers there. But what's interesting with this is every year, all of our top 3 yielding producers are over 17,000 pounds per acre. So they're consistently achieving these extremely high biomass crops. And again, when you break that out by top and bottom, we're seeing about anywhere from 6 to 10,000 pounds per acre difference between those low yielding and high yielding producers. I'm not going to get too much into climate because there's a lot of data there, but I think because I touched on a little bit about the estimated use of water, I thought I would show some of that data. So the blue bars there are the average total available water across all the farms. So 2023 for us was a very dry year. And then you can see the green bar there is the average estimated use of water. So for most years, we're probably about using half of what's actually available. But again, when you break out the top and the bottom, you can see there the top producers tended to have very high high uses of their total available water, and on average they're using anywhere from 56 to 93% of their total available water, whereas those lower yielding producers are using 40 to 70% of the total available water. And so we are trying to understand, part of that we recognize is having higher biomass crops is going to use more water, but there's definitely something more there that we want to try and understand. What is it about those farms that are able to access that water better? And we have a grower in Michigan, for example, where we think what has happened is he has a perched water table that we're not taking into consideration, and perhaps that's a reason why he's consistently seeing these yields. We can't ask growers to go out and dig soil pits on top of everything else they're doing, so we're going to try to figure out, a way to maybe do that on a couple farms and see what we find there, but that's definitely something we're still trying to discover. And as we learn more in this program, honestly, I feel like there's just more that we're like, oh, we don't know, which is, exciting. So I guess the thing with all of this is, okay, so you collect all this data, that high biomass crops and high heads per meter square is what's going to help you achieve yields, but what can we actually do on farm to achieve that? And so one of the things, I'm not going to show some yen data on this, but is row widths. And we've got some really great data in Ontario and Michigan, and I just threw in one slide because of time here. But what we're finding, at least in our part of the world, is that as we go to narrow row spacing, we're seeing pretty significant jumps in yield. So in Ontario and Michigan, our typical row width is actually 7.5-inch rows. But where growers are really starting to get some keen interest is moving to 5-inch rows, because we're seeing an advantage to that. And so this is some work from Manny Singh. It's 4 site years. It's all within the ideal planting window. But what we're seeing is, a 10 bushel across these 4 years, as an example, increase in yield just from going 2.5 inches narrower. And of course, I believe out here you're a little bit wider than 7.5 inch, 10-inch rows. Yeah. So we see a pretty significant response to even just going from 10-inch to 7.5 inch, and that data is pretty strong in Ontario, and so we're seeing consistent 7.5 inch rows. But we think that by going to 5-inch rows, we can increase our heads per meter square in biomass even more. And what's interesting on the right there, what Manny is finding as well, is that we don't actually need to go to these crazy high seeding rates. We can actually achieve these high yields at much lower seeding rates. And you can see there, as we went from 1 million to 1.5 million, the yield differences was not statistic. So you could save 500,000 seeds per acre, which is, sorry, you guys do pounds per acre. I gotta think about this. I think that's 50 pounds per acre. 1.2 million seeds per acre is 120 pounds. So 1 million is 100 pounds, so you have 500,000 would be 50 pounds. So you can see there's a significant seed savings there if we're planting earlier and going to those narrow row spacings. We also look at planting date and seeding rates, and so on average, the high yielding producers, with the exception of 2021, are anywhere from 1 week to 2 weeks ahead of the lower yielding producers. But what's even more exciting is that those high yielding producers are using much lower seeding rates. So in 22 and 23, the high yielding producers on average were using 200 to 275,000 seeds per acre less than the lower yielding producers. One of our highest yielding producers, Jeff Crone, who's been in it year over year, he's always under 1 million seeds per acre, or less than 100 pounds per acre. And Eric Watson, who's the New Zealand world record grower, he's anywhere from 500,000 to 750,000 seeds per acre, and he's achieving 260 bushel wheat at those seeding rates. So there's definitely more to this and things that we want to dive deeper into. And here's a really good, I think, summary of what is happening. So those top 2 bars there, those are earlier planting dates. So that's a mid-September, late September planting date. The gray bar is a mid-October. The green is a late October, and this red bar is the early November. And so and then on the bottom here, we've got our seeding rate. And so what you can see there is, even though that we always tell our growers, if you're planting late, to bump up your seeding rate. In Ontario, our recommendation is 200,000 seeds per week for every day or every week you delay planting. So we thought, okay, well, let's take a look at this. So we dove into it, and even as you increase your seeding rate there, these later planting dates never come even close to what you can achieve at those earlier planting dates. So those earlier planting dates are absolutely critical for high biomass, high yielding crops. The other question, or I guess challenge we always get is, well, if you're planting late, up your seeding rate, but also intensify your management. I can manage my way out of a late planting date. And so fortunately, we have some really great data to debunk that as well. So this is from some trials that were done in Ontario for 2 years with Emma Dielman. She was a grad student with Dr. Dave Hooker, Josh Nozelsky, and myself. And she did two locations, 4 planting dates, early, mid-late, and late. And she did 2 different management strategies. So she did what we would classify as a standard, so about just a little over 100 pounds of nitrogen, 20 pounds of sulfur, which is pretty standard for us, and just a T3 fungicide, compared to what we would call an intensive system in Ontario, which is closer to 160 pounds of nitrogen, still 20 pounds of sulfur or so, but we also add in a second fungicide as well as a plant growth regulator to manage lodging. And so our thinking was, well, with these later planting dates, an intensive management system is for sure gonna come out as helping us improve those yields, but it absolutely did not. We could not manage our way out of a late planting date. And so the blue bar there is the intensive management, the orange or the red bar there is the standard management. And so even as we delayed planting here, you can see that intensive management, it didn't help compensate for that late planting date. So we're seeing planting date, seeding rates will trump management in terms of trying to maximize our yield. And so similar to what we're finding in the end, what was actually contributing to those yields, it was all about heads per meter square. Kernels per head, kernel weight was highly variable, and that was highly dependent on the environment and the growing season that we had. But they also saw the same consistent results we're seeing in the yen, and that is that we're just seeing a much higher biomass, which also the rate of biomass accumulation was greater. And why this is so important and why we talk so much about biomass is because it's all about this. It's all about capturing the solar radiation and being able to convert that into grain. And so with earlier planting dates, we're achieving canopy closure or maximum solar radiation capture much earlier. We're capturing or achieving 90% solar radiation capture by flag leaf, whereas in our later planting dates, we're not achieving 90% until almost physiological maturity, so almost to the point where it's not even worth it. It's not doing anything. So that's why we talk so much about biomass, and it's really about being able to capture and maximize the solar radiation that's occurring. We also found within that grain fill rate and duration definitely varied amongst years, primarily related to weather, and that's also what we're seeing with our yen data as well. And I didn't show that here, I apologize, but I just wanted to make sure I could get through everything. So that's kind of the main, I guess, messages that we're learning from the yen in terms of what growers can do. The other big challenge, though, that we get is, well, those high-yielding producers are throwing everything but the kitchen sink at their crop, and that's why they're always at 160, 170. But what we're actually finding, it is not about how much they're applying or what they're applying, but it's a matter of about when they're applying it and why they're applying it. It's all about the attention to detail. So we hear growers all the time say, oh, I gotta get my nitrogen on because it's early season, but I'm like, how many tillers do you have in your field? How much nitrogen have you put down? What's your goals? Like they have no idea. It's just because it's April 17th, I gotta get 190 or 150 pounds of nitrogen on, I'm gonna go. Whereas these high-yielding producers are being very meticulous about their decision-making and really understanding why they're doing what they're doing. And so this was the past high-yielding producer this year, Nick Sewin from Wayland, Michigan. And Nick, you can see there, almost 172 bushels per acre, and he achieved 93% of what we thought he could achieve. So we modeled that he could achieve 184, and he achieved 172. I talked about those high-yielding producers always being above 17,000 pounds of biomass. Well, Nick was at 18,000, and he had a total available water of 338 millimeters. He does a little bit of tillage after soybeans. October 3rd is within the ideal range of his planting window within Michigan. He likes to bump up his seeding rates in his narrow row spacings, and Nick is one that we're trying to convince to actually back off on that seeding rate because we think he could still achieve that. He does put some fertility down, particularly phosphorus, a little bit of phosphorus there. But he isn't putting crazy amounts of nitrogen on. So he's putting 155 pounds of nitrogen on in season. He's split applying it. He's putting his PGR and his micros on early at first node, especially with some of these micros. Growers are putting them on at T3 or later, but nutrient uptake is, before flag leaf, we'll have 80% of these nutrients were within the crop already. So we're seeing some wasted dollars, so to speak, in those later applications. He did do a 3-pass fungicide program, and again, being in the US, he did throw that insecticide. But I also want to highlight there, he's got 956 heads per meter square. So he's hitting that high 900 plus target to be able to achieve that 172 bushels. This guy here, Jeff Crone, is the most interesting grower of them all. He's been in it for 4 years. He's won it. He's won the highest yield potential. He's always in the top 3. He achieved 170 bushels per acre. And we actually thought his farm would only be able to achieve 109 bushels per acre. So he achieved way more than what we thought. And he's the grower that we think has a perched water table that we're not able to account for, because we assume a rooting depth of about 15 meters. So we account for water within that much of the soil profile, but we're wondering, or it's not 15 meters, 1.5 meters. Sorry, that's super high, 1.5 meters. Sorry, I had 1.5 in my head. 1.5 meters, not 15. So what we're thinking is that perhaps he's a perched water table, or his crop has the ability, there's some maybe capillary action or something going on there that's able to allow him to access more water, because you can see in 24, he only had 96 millimeters of rain for the whole season. But he is still able to achieve this astronomical yield. He's primarily conservation tillage. He always plants after his edible beans. He's also a big cover crop grower, narrow seeding rates, and he's only seeding at 850,000 seeds per acre. Again, modest, what I would consider modest, or a typical nitrogen rate of 148 pounds, split applying. And again, he's just really targeting his foliars, his fungicides, all of that at the right time. And again, 995 heads per meter square. And then we've also, of course, got John Kilborn. He was our third place producer this year, 160 bushels. He, again, 17,000 pounds of biomass per acre. And am I way over time? No. Oh, okay, sorry. Again, 7.5-inch rows. He's using 149 pounds, all split applied. He is a hard red wheat grower, so that later application is for that. But again, he's achieving around 900 heads per meter square. And I'll just very quickly, because I apologize, but we also do a bit of an economic analysis on all these farms, and what we're finding is really interesting is these farms are applying, or 70% of their costs are going into fertility, and 30% is into crop protection. And then if we look at the high and low, so the top is the top 20% and the bottom is the bottom 20%, typically we're seeing the top producers apply more nitrogen and apply more sulfur, but for everything else there you can see their inputs is much less. And so on average per bushel, the top yielding producers are spending about $2 a bushel, and the high yielding producers are just over $3 per bushel. So yeah, again, what can we do? Plant within our optimum window, consider narrow row spacing, and it's all about attention to detail, more so than more. It's not always just more. It's about when you're applying, what you're applying, and what you're trying to actually target. So again, this is only 4 years of data. It's a huge geographical span, so we're still learning lots, but essentially our goal is to be able to actually determine optimum nutrient contents for both grain, straw. Almost all of our tissue and soil tests come back deficient for boron as an example, but we actually have no idea how much boron should be in your tissue test. So these are some of the things that we're hoping to actually come out of this. We're also working on creating some dashboards for producers so they can go online, they can play with the data by location, by soil type, by year, and play around with their own data. And then a big part of this program is the networking. So we do kickoff meetings, summer tours. Next year we're taking the group to the UK. We do a wrap-up meeting where we do a full deep dive analysis. And this past year we actually started a WhatsApp group. And I thought this was going to be just like a casual thing, but it is not. We've got 90 farmers in it, and they talk to each other every day, all day. And it is amazing. Like they are already talking about the 2025 crop. It's like, hey, I'm thinking about trying this. What do you think about this? And it's been really, really cool to see the enthusiasm and engagement of these folks. And so lastly, I know I'm standing here today, but there is a whole team of us that goes into this. We've got partners with the grower organizations are a huge part of this. As I mentioned, this is a program by the growers for the growers. We've got the Grain Farmers of Ontario, Michigan Wheat Program, ourselves at OMAFRA, and Michigan State and the U of G, and so those are the folks there. And Dennis Pennington from Michigan is my counterpart, and he is a huge role in this, and the last 4 years would not have gotten through this without him. And so a big thank you to our sponsors, and I'm sorry, I think I'm out of time and had to speed it up, but I'll take any questions.
Thank you. I think we have time.
Thanks for the wonderful, engaging presentation. I didn't think about lunch once. I liked the inclusion of the economic breakdown at the end there, and I'm curious to know, my perception of these types of yield trials has always been that you're outspending what you actually make at the end. But I think I'm wrong in that, just based on what you've been describing, and I'm wondering if all the growers everywhere were always at the 100% mark, would there just be a lot more money flowing into the system, or what is your sense of that?
I don't think so. I think it's more about where you're placing those dollars. And what I mean by that is, I think sometimes growers, we talked about, getting salespeople, and they might think, oh, I need to apply that extra fungicide, but maybe rather than applying that extra fungicide in the absence of disease, you apply that extra dollar into nitrogen or sulfur, where it's going to pay you back. So I don't think if we were to hit that 100%, we would just continue to do that. I think we would just be better at allocating it into the right places, if that makes sense. I will say about this economics though, like we use the cost of production budgets from the MAFRA, and we also use, the University of Guelph does a really extensive survey every year, twice a year, so we use that data. And we primarily just use nutrients and crop protection because everyone has different buying power for everything. For seed, everyone has different overhead costs, so we kind of keep it simple like this, but eventually we would like to get into an even more complex economic analysis to be able to get to more clarity on some of those things.
Question to bring it home to Manitoba. What's one thing that the growers that joined the program with the least amount of effort, what was one thing that was the most common to change in their practice to increase their yield?
That's a good question. I would say easy, hands down, planting date. And what I mean by that is, in our part of the world, soybeans, I have to battle soybeans and corn. And so growers are always trying to maximize their soybeans. And so, especially with these newer varieties and with climate change, we're able to extend our soybean growing season. But what's happening is that's cutting into our wheat planting window. And so what these growers are actually doing now is they're selecting for their wheat acres shorter season varieties, even if it's like a half a maturity group, because that allows them to get those soybeans off 7 to 14 days earlier, and then they can get their wheat in earlier. Or we've had growers start to grow edible beans or winter canola just so they can get that off to get their wheat in. But I would say planting date has been the #1 thing they've changed to dramatically increase yields, and the most cost-effective way too.
Thank you so much, Joanna. That was a wonderful presentation.